The snow came down in curtains that night, thick and soundless, the kind that swallowed the world whole and left nothing behind but white. Marin Quill pressed her youngest daughter against her chest and listened to the child's breathing. It had grown shallow over the last hour, each inhale a little thinner than the one before, and every time little Cora's ribcage shuddered against Marin's palm, something inside Marin cracked just a fraction more. They were sheltered beneath a rock overhang on the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range, in the territory of Montana, in the bitter and unforgiving January of 1891. Sheltered was a generous word. The overhang kept the worst of the snow off their heads, but the wind came sideways, finding every gap in the horse blanket Marin had stretched across the opening, raking through the thin wool like it had a personal grudge. Beside her, pressed into the cold stone wall, 8-year-old Dex was asleep, or pretending to be. He had stopped asking if they were going to be all right 2 days ago. Children understood more than grown people gave them credit for. He had tucked his knees to his chest, his worn boots soaked through and stiff as boards, and Marin could see his small jaw working silently in the firelight. Not asleep, just too tired and too scared to keep his eyes open. The fire was the problem. It was barely a fire at all anymore. 3 days of wet wood and dwindling pine needles had reduced it to a nest of sullen orange embers that gave light but precious little heat. Marin fed the last dry splinter she had into the coals and watched it take reluctantly, a thin blue flame that wavered once, and then settled into something pitiful and small. She had been trying to get to Darby. The town was only 20 miles south through the pass, not far at all by the measure of a map, but the blizzard had rolled down from the Canadian north without warning 4 days ago and shut the pass like a door slamming in her face. She had the mule still, bless the stubborn animal, tied just outside the overhang and pressing its thick neck against the rock for warmth. She had the horse blanket, the 2 children, a half-empty sack of cornmeal, a tin pot, and the deed to a piece of land she was no longer certain she was going to live long enough to collect on. It had been her husband's land. Edmund's land, she corrected herself silently, because even in her own mind she found herself reaching for him and finding only the empty space where he used to be. Edmund Quill had been a quiet man, a methodical man, the kind who measured twice and cut once, who kept his accounts in a small red ledger and never borrowed what he couldn't repay. He had homesteaded 200 acres in the Bitterroot Valley 3 years prior, built a solid timber house with good north-facing windows, and had been on the honest edge of turning a real profit from his cattle operation when Rutherford Crane found out about the water rights. Rutherford Crane did not own the Bitterroot Valley, but he behaved as though the distinction was a technicality. He ran cattle on 4,000 acres at the valley's southern end, controlled the ferry crossings at Sweetwater Bend, and had the ear of every appointed official between Missoula and the Idaho border. When the spring snowmelt ran heavy and it became clear that Edmund's Upper Creek was the primary feeder for the basin that kept Crane's southern pasture green through August, Crane made an offer on the land. Edmund declined politely. Crane made the offer again, less politely. Edmund declined again. 2 months later, Edmund was dead. The deputy who came to the house said it was a riding accident on the North Fork Trail, said his horse had spooked at something and thrown him against the rocks, said these things happened, especially to men who rode alone in rough country. The deputy had Crane's cattle brand embossed on his belt buckle. Marin had noticed it while he was speaking to her and had not said a word, because she had 2 children standing behind her and no one in the county she trusted enough to tell. She had lasted 6 weeks after that, before Crane's lawyer arrived at her door with a document she didn't understand and a sheriff's deputy she did. The document claimed Edmund had borrowed against the land title as collateral for a supply debt Marin had never heard of from a mercantile in Missoula she had never visited. The signature looked something like Edmund's. The debt was larger than the land's assessed value. She had 48 hours to vacate the premises, the lawyer said. in the same tone a man might use to announce supper was ready. She had taken the children, the mule, Edmund's coat, and the small tin box she kept under the kitchen floorboard that held $31 in coins and a copy of the original land grant. That paper, she knew, was the only proof she had that the land had ever been theirs. She had been riding for Darby when the blizzard caught her, hoping to reach the federal land office before Crane could file his forged documents, hoping there was a law somewhere above the county line that still meant something. Now she sat in the dark with 2 children and a dying fire and wondered if she had made a catastrophic mistake. "Mama." Cora's voice came out thin as paper. "I'm cold inside." "I know, sweetheart." Marin pulled the child tighter, tucking the horse blanket around them both until Cora's face was pressed against her collarbone. "You hold on to me. That's your only job tonight. You hold on." She did not tell her daughter the storm would break by morning. She did not know if it would. She sat and listened to the wind and tried to calculate how long 3 people could survive at these temperatures, with no fire and no shelter worth the name, and the numbers she arrived at were not encouraging. Dex stirred. His head came up and his eyes opened, and in the low orange glow of the coals Marin saw his expression change from the loose blankness of exhausted sleep to something sharp and alert. "Something's out there," he whispered. Marin heard it then, not the wind. Something heavier, deliberate, a rhythm in the snow, a weight moving through the dark that was too purposeful for any weather. She reached for the single thing she had that could be called a weapon, the long-handled iron skillet she cooked their cornmeal in, which she had been keeping close, not for any rational reason, but because it was solid and heavy, and made her feel marginally less helpless. She shifted Cora off her lap as gently as she could, stood up in the narrow space under the overhang, and positioned herself between her children and the blanket she had stretched across the opening. The footsteps stopped. Marin gripped the skillet handle until her knuckles ached. The horse blanket bellied inward against a sudden gust, and through the gap at its edge she could see nothing but dark and snow and the vague suggestion of tree shapes in the gray distance. Then the blanket was pulled aside from the outside, and the cold rushed in hard and total, and Marin raised the skillet above her head. The man who filled the opening was enormous. That was the first and only thing her mind was able to process for a full 2 seconds. He was wearing a canvas duster over what appeared to be several layers of wool and hide, and he was dusted in snow from the brim of his hat to the tops of his boots, which were the largest boots Marin had ever seen on a living person. He carried a lantern in his left hand and something long and dark slung over his right shoulder that it took her a moment to identify as a freshly taken mule deer. His eyes, when he found hers, were dark brown and very steady. He looked at her. He looked at the skillet. He looked at the 2 children behind her, at the pitiful remnants of the fire, at the horse blanket and the sack of cornmeal, and all the evidence of how badly things had gone. He did not appear surprised. He appeared, if anything, like a man doing a rapid and experienced calculation. "I'm not here to harm you," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, a baritone that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Name's Whitfield. Jonas Whitfield. I run a line cabin about 1.5 miles up the North Ridge. Saw your fire last night from the high trail. Came back when the wind shifted." He paused. "How long have you been out here?" Marin did not lower the skillet. 4 days. Something moved through the man's expression that was not quite pity and not quite anger. It was the look of a person who has seen something that should not have been allowed to happen. "The little one," he said, nodding toward Cora. "She sick?" "She's cold. They're both cold, ma'am." Jonas Whitfield looked directly at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her, the way a person looks at another person they are taking seriously. "My cabin has a stove and 4 walls and a wood store that'll last the month. I've got dried elk and salt pork and a medical kit with proper supplies. Your children need warmth and food right now, tonight." He shifted the deer off his shoulder and set it down in the snow outside the overhang, freeing his hands. "I know you don't know me. I know you've got no reason to trust a stranger in the dark, but that fire has maybe 20 minutes left in it, and after that, I don't know what you've got." Marin looked at him for a long moment. She had spent the last 6 weeks learning that men who showed up at her door offering things were men who wanted something in return. She had learned it the hard way, and the lesson had settled into her bones the way the cold had. But Cora made a sound against her back. A small, fragile, hitching sound. Marin lowered the skillet. "Dex," she said quietly, "get your sister's coat on." The walk to the cabin was the most grueling mile and a half of Marin's life, and she had spent the previous 4 days in a blizzard. Jonas Whitfield broke trail ahead of them, the deer back over one shoulder, and his lantern held out to cast light on the snow, and the path he cut through the drifts was wide enough that Marin could follow without the snow reaching her hips. She carried Cora. Dex walked beside her with his hand locked in hers, his chin down, fighting for every step. Twice he stumbled, and Jonas was there before Marin could react, one massive hand catching the boy's arm and steadying him without a word, without making a production of it, just catching him and setting him right and moving on. The cabin appeared out of the dark like something Marin might have imagined. A broad, low structure built of hand-squared logs, its single window throwing a faint orange rectangle of light across the snow, its chimney already trailing smoke. Jonas had left a fire going. The thought struck her with unexpected force. He had left a fire going before he came out to look for whoever had made that small, desperate flame in the dark below his ridge. He shouldered the door open and stepped back to let them through first. The heat hit Marin like a wall. She stood just inside the doorway for a moment and simply breathed it in, this ordinary warmth, this thing she had stopped believing in 3 days ago. The stove in the corner was a big iron affair, its belly glowing red at the seams. The cabin was one room, spare and meticulously organized. A bunk along one wall, a workbench along another, shelves of tin goods and bundled herbs and carefully labeled glass jars. A rifle and a shorter carbine hung above the door. The floor was packed dirt covered in sewn hides. It smelled like pine smoke and dried herbs and something savory that was still warm in a covered pot on the back of the stove. Jonas crossed the room and lifted the bunk's wool blankets down from a shelf. He handed them to Marin without ceremony. "Get the wet things off the children. Wrap them in these. I'll stoke the fire." Marin stripped Dex and Cora of their soaked outer layers with shaking hands. Her own fingers had gone mostly numb, and she fumbled at the buttons, but she got them down to their dry undershirts and wrapped them in the wool and sat them close to the stove. Dex reached out and pressed his palm flat against the iron casing and pulled it back with a sound of pure, involuntary relief. Cora leaned against her brother and closed her eyes. Jonas ladled something from the pot into 2 tin cups and carried them over. It was a bone broth, deep amber and rich with salt and the faint sweetness of dried onion, and he handed it to the children with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that cold-shocked bodies needed warming from the inside before they needed anything else. He was right. Marin had known that, but watching him do it with such matter-of-fact competence made something in her chest ache in a way she didn't entirely understand. He handed a 3rd cup to Marin and went back to the stove without waiting for her thanks. She drank it too fast. The warmth spread through her like sunrise, and she was embarrassed to find that tears had started down her face before she even felt them coming. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. Jonas glanced at her from the stove. "No need," he said simply, and turned back to what he was doing. He treated Cora's hands for early frostbite with a salve he made by warming beeswax and a dried herb he called yarrow root together in a small tin, working with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the sheer size of him. He checked Dex's feet and declared them cold but not damaged, and found a pair of thick wool socks, 4 sizes too large, that Dex put on anyway, and seemed to consider an enormous personal triumph. He fed the children a proper meal of reheated elk stew with dried beans and hardtack, and watched with something that looked like private satisfaction as Dex ate 3 helpings and Cora managed half a cup before falling deeply, heavily asleep against the side of the bunk. Marin sat across the room and watched all of this and tried to understand what kind of she had walked into the cabin of. When the children were sleeping, Jonas sat down on the workbench across the room and poured 2 cups of something from a clay jug that turned out to be very strong chicory coffee, and he set one on the edge of the table near Marin without comment. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Darby, the Federal Land Office." He was quiet for a moment. "In a blizzard. With 2 children. On a mule. I didn't know the storm was coming." "What's in Darby?" Marin looked at him. She had told herself she wasn't going to explain herself to another stranger. She had told herself that twice in the last hour, but there was something in the way Jonas Whitfield asked questions that made them feel less like interrogation, and more like someone simply trying to understand the full shape of a problem they were already invested in solving. He asked, and then he waited. He didn't fill the silence with his own assumptions, and in Marin's recent experience, that was rare enough to be disarming. She told him about Edmund, about the land and the water rights and Rutherford Crane's offer, and the riding accident that wasn't one. She told him about the lawyer and the forged debt and the 48 hours. She told him about the land grant copy in the tin box in her saddlebag, and the deputy's belt buckle, and the 6 weeks she had spent trying to figure out who she could trust, while Crane's men made it very clear they were watching the house. She told him more than she had intended to, and when she stopped, the cabin was very quiet except for Cora's even breathing and the knock of a log settling in the stove. Jonas was looking at his coffee cup. His jaw was set. "Rutherford Crane," he said, as though tasting the name and finding it exactly as unpleasant as expected. "You know him. I know of him." Jonas set the cup down. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "10 years ago, I had a partner, man named August Pell. Good man, good trapper. We ran a line together in the Selway country north of here for 4 seasons. He stopped. Crane wanted the fur rights to the North Basin. August held the territorial permit. Crane offered to buy him out. August said no. About 3 months later, August drowned crossing a creek he'd crossed 100 times. The permit transferred to the next of kin, who was a cousin in Ohio who'd never seen a fur trap in his life, and who sold the rights to a Missoula outfit within a month. The Missoula outfit had Crane money behind it. Jonas looked up. "I couldn't prove any of it. I still can't." Marin felt the cold that had nothing to do with temperature move through her again. "He's done this before. He does it when he wants something badly enough." Jonas's eyes were very level. "And when he decides someone is going to get out of his way, they generally do." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced something that made Marin go completely still. It was a small tin button, the kind stamped with an embossed letter, the kind that came off a specific style of coat. The letter on it was the letter E. Marin knew that button. She had sewn it back onto Edmund's good coat 3 times over the years, because the thread never held the way it should, and she had complained about it each time, and Edmund had laughed and said she could complain about it as many times as it needed re-sewing. "Where did you get that?" Her voice came out, barely above a whisper. Jonas set it on the table between them. "I found it last autumn on the North Fork Trail, 6 feet off the path, caught in the root of a pine at the base of a 12-foot drop." He met her eyes. There were drag marks in the soil around the roots, Marin, and no sign the horse had gone over the edge. The room tilted. Marin put one hand flat on the table and held it there and breathed. Edmund had not fallen. He had been dragged to the edge and put over it, and the only reason Jonas Whitfield had found the button and kept it was because he was a man who noticed things in the wilderness and understood what those things meant. "You've been holding on to this," she said. "I didn't know whose it was. Didn't know who to give it to. I asked in Darby and got told the accident was settled and closed." He paused. "Now I know." She wept. She had not wept since the deputy came to her door. had not let herself because there had always been something immediately in front of her that needed doing, a child to feed, a decision to make, a direction to choose. But the button sitting on the table in the lantern light was Edmund made solid and small, and the drag marks in the soil were his last moments made real. And she had been carrying the weight of not knowing the truth for months, and now she knew, and the knowing broke something open that she could not hold closed. Jonas did not say anything. He did not move to comfort her or tell her it was going to be all right. He sat across the room and let her grieve in the particular dignity of someone who is not being watched or managed, and that somehow was the kindest thing he could have done. The storm held for 2 more days. Inside the cabin, a different kind of weather moved through. Dex recovered with the speed that only children possess, springing back from the edge of hypothermia with an energy that struck Marin as almost offensive. And he followed Jonas around the cabin with the focused intensity of a boy who has decided to catalog everything a man does and file it away for later use. Jonas, for his part, seemed neither bothered nor performative about it. He showed Dex how to check the set of a snare without springing it, demonstrated the correct angle for sharpening a blade, and spent an entire quiet afternoon teaching the boy to read a hand-drawn topographical map, laying it out on the workbench and explaining how the lines told you where the ridges were, where the water ran, where the game trails cut through the high country. Dex absorbed it all in silence, and then asked 3 devastatingly precise questions that made Jonas look at the boy with a new and particular attention. Cora's hands healed. The frostbite had been caught early enough, and the yarrow salve did its work, and by the second morning she was flexing her fingers experimentally and demanding to know if Jonas had any animals on the property. He told her there was a barn cat that was actively hostile to human company. Cora said she understood hostile cats and went to find it. By afternoon the cat was sitting in her lap in front of the stove with the betrayed expression of an animal who has caved to a social pressure it did not foresee. Marin watched all of this from the table where she had spread Edmund's land grant copy and was going over every line of it, writing notes in the margins, in small careful letters, building the case she was going to need to make in Derby. On the second evening, Jonas sat down across from her with 2 cups of coffee and looked at what she was doing with an expression of quiet concentration. "You've been at this all day," he said. "Crane's lawyer will have filed the forged documents by now. I need to be able to counter every claim the moment I walk into that land office." She rubbed her eyes. "The grant is legitimate. Edmund filed it properly. The date stamp is from 1888, which predates any debt claim Crane could manufacture by 3 years. And if I can present the button and your testimony about the North Fork—" "My testimony won't hold much in a county court," Jonas said quietly. "Not against Crane's money. I'm not going to county court." Marin looked up. "I'm going federal. The Homestead Act disputes go through the federal land commissioner, not the county bench. Crane owns the county. He doesn't own the federal government." She paused. "Not yet, anyway." Jonas was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. After a moment she identified it. It was respect, the specific variety that is surprised into existence. "You've thought about this for a while," he said. "I've had 6 weeks and no one to talk to, except a mule and 2 children who are too young to worry." The corner of Jonas's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one, and on his weathered, careful face it looked like something that took some effort to arrive at and was therefore worth something. "I'll ride with you to Derby when the pass clears," he said. "As a witness, whatever that's worth." Marin looked at him. "Why?" Jonas picked up his coffee and was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked in the corner. Outside, the wind moved through the high pines with a sound like distant water. "I've been up here 11 years, he said finally. "Came up after August died. Told myself it was the life, trapping the high country, no people, no obligations. Told myself I was done with towns and the things that happen in towns." He set the cup down. "But Crane's been doing this for 15 years that I know of, and nobody has ever stood in front of him and used the actual law against him, because every time someone tries, they get bought or scared or buried before they can finish. He looked at her. You've got the deed, the date stamp, and a dead man's button from a crime scene. You're the first person I've seen in 11 years who might actually have enough to do it. On the third morning, the storm broke. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a world reforming itself, the creak of pines releasing their loads of snow, the tentative sound of meltwater starting somewhere under the ice on the north slope. The sky came up clear and hard, and the deepest blue Marin had ever seen over the Montana mountains. Jonas saddled his bay horse and helped Marin load the mule, and they set out for Darby, with the children riding double on the mule's broad back, and the land grant folded in the tin box in Marin's coat pocket. The pass was passable, and Jonas knew every switchback on it, every place where the drift would be treacherous, and every place where the ground was solid underneath. They were 2 hours out from the cabin when Marin noticed the riders. 3 of them, coming up the South Trail at a pace that was too purposeful for men on ordinary business. She saw Jonas see them at the same moment. His posture changed almost imperceptibly, the easy rolling gait of a man walking a familiar trail shifting into something more deliberate, more contained. "Do you know them?" Marin asked quietly. "The one in the front is Wade Pritchett," Jonas said. His voice was very even. "Crane's range foreman. The other 2 are hands. They've been tracking you. Your trail, from the overhang, is plain as a road in this snow." Marin's heart hammered. "The children, Dex." Jonas turned and spoke to the boy, without raising his voice. "Take your sister and the mule off the trail into those spruce on the left. Go now, quietly, and don't come out until I call you." Dex did not argue. He turned the mule off the trail and into the trees. Without a word, Cora pressed against his back, and the spruce closed around them, and they were gone. Wade Pritchett pulled up 15 feet away. He was a compact man with a sparse mustache and the particular look of someone who had spent years doing other people's unpleasant work and had made peace with it. "Mrs. Quill," he said. "Mr. Crane would like a word." "Mr. Crane can address me through the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Darby," Marin said. "I'll be there by this afternoon." Pritchett looked at Jonas. "Whitfield didn't take you for a man who got involved in other people's business." "I'm not involved in anyone's business," Jonas said pleasantly. "I'm taking a neighbor to town." "That's a thing people do." "Mrs. Quill is going to need to come with us," Pritchett said. His tone had not changed, which was somehow worse than if it had. "There's a matter of stolen property. The land grant document she removed from her former residence." "That document belongs to me," Marin said. "It is a federal homestead grant issued in my husband's name and transferred to me on his death. It is not Crane's property, and it never was." "That's going to be sorted out," Pritchett said, "by people above your pay grade, Mrs. Quill. For now you need to." Jonas stepped forward, not fast, not aggressively, just forward, placing himself with a kind of geological certainty between Pritchett and Marin. "She's given you her answer," he said. "She's going to Darby. You're going to let her pass, or you're going to explain to the federal marshal why you interfered with a homestead claimant on her way to the land office." He paused. "I've met Marshal Crane's men before. Their testimony goes about as far as their boss's reach, which stops at the county line. The marshal's reach doesn't." Something moved across Pritchett's face. A calculation, quick and private. "This isn't finished," Pritchett said. "No," Jonas agreed. "It isn't. It's going to be finished in Darby, in front of a federal commissioner, with witnesses and documentation. That's exactly how it should be finished." He met Pritchett's eyes. "Go tell your employer that." The 3 riders sat still for a long moment. Then Pritchett turned his horse, and they went back down the south trail the way they'd come, and Marin let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like several minutes. Jonas turned back and called the children out of the trees. Dex brought the mule up the trail with an expression of fierce, concentrated calm that made Marin's chest ache. with a pride so sharp it was almost grief. They reached Derby by early afternoon. The federal land commissioner was a meticulous woman named Grace Aldridge, who wore reading spectacles on a chain around her neck and examined the land grant with the focused attention of someone who had seen every variety of fraud the Western Territory had to offer and could identify legitimate documentation on site. She read the date stamp. She read the original survey figures. She read the margin notes Maren had made on the train ride from Missoula, cross-referencing the grant against the public record. She looked at the tin button and listened to Jonas Whitfield describe in flat, precise detail what he had found on the North Fork Trail and where. Then she sent a telegram to the federal marshal's office in Helena. Rutherford Crane's legal documents were examined by a federal auditor 6 days later. The debt records were determined to be fraudulent, the notary seal a forgery, and the signature a practiced imitation of Edmund Quill's actual hand that would not have passed scrutiny under proper light. Crane was arrested that March, along with Wade Pritchett and 2 others. The charges were numerous. The land, all 200 acres of it, was restored to Maren Quill by federal order. She did not go back to the Bitterroot Valley immediately. There was too much to settle, and the cabin on the property needed work that would take the spring and half the summer, and the children needed time in a proper town with a school and a doctor and other children nearby. She stayed in Derby and found work keeping books for the general store, which turned out to suit her considerably better than she expected. Jonas came down from the ridge in April, when the snow was off the high trails and the melt was running hard in the creek beds. He rode into Derby on a Thursday morning with 2 months' worth of fur trade in his pack, and the look of a man who has spent 2 months arguing with himself and has finally reached a conclusion. He found Maren behind the counter of the general store with an account ledger open in front of her, and Cora asleep in a chair in the back room, and Dex at school 4 blocks away. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his hat in his hands, and Maren looked up at him with the expression of a woman who has been expecting something and is relieved to find it has arrived. "I've been thinking," Jonas said, "about coming down off the ridge." "Have you?" Maren said. "The line cabin is gone," he said. He had rebuilt the basics of it, but the original structure had taken damage in the January freeze, and he'd spent the winter rethinking whether it made sense to reconstruct it in the same place. "I've been thinking about the Bitterroot." Maren set her pen down. "The Bitterroot is 200 acres of good timberland and creek access and cattle pasture that I know nothing about running on my own." "I know some things about running land," Jonas said. "I'm aware of that," Maren said. They looked at each other across the counter of the general store, and something settled between them that did not need a great many more words to be understood. Dex came back from school that afternoon and found Jonas Whitfield at the kitchen table of their rented rooms, drinking coffee and listening to Maren read aloud from the terms of a partnership agreement she had drafted in her careful handwriting, and Dex stood in the doorway with his schoolbooks under his arm and assessed the situation with the precision of a boy who has been paying very close attention for several months. "Are you staying, Dex?" asked Jonas. Jonas looked at the boy. "If your mother agrees to it." Dex considered this for a moment. "She already agreed," he said. "She's been different since you came to town. She's been like herself again." He set his books on the shelf by the door and went to find his sister, as though the matter were entirely settled, which, Maren reflected, watching Jonas's expression as he absorbed those words, perhaps it was. The following spring, the Quill land had cattle on it for the first time, 12 head of good Montana stock, and a kitchen garden that produced more than the household needed, and a new section of fence along the East Creek boundary that Dex had helped Jonas set post by post over the course of a warm September week. The timber house still stood, solid as Edmund had built it, and Maren had repainted the front door a deep red that could be seen from the bottom of the long approach trail. On a clear October evening, Marin stood on the porch of that house and watched Jonas walking back from the barn with Cora on his shoulders. The child's hands in his hair and her laughter rolling clean across the valley. Dex was at the fence line, doing something careful and deliberate with a length of wire. The way he did most things, now that he was 9 and had decided competence was the most important quality a person could develop. The mountains were turning gold and deep copper at their peaks, and the sky above the Bitterroot was the color it only ever got in October. That particular saturated blue that had no name but that you would recognize anywhere for the rest of your life, once you had seen it over these specific ridges. Jonas set Cora down at the porch steps, and the child ran past Marin into the house, trailing noise and movement the way she always did, filling the rooms up with herself. Jonas came up the steps and stood beside Marin, and she felt the warmth of him the way you feel a fire through a wall, steady and present and real. 11 years is a long time to stay away from something, he said, not looking at her, looking at the valley. You came back, Marin said. You brought me back, he said simply, the way he said most true things, without decoration, without apology, without any suggestion that it cost him anything to say it, though she suspected it had cost him quite a lot. She reached out and found his hand where it rested on the porch rail. His fingers closed around hers. Below them, the valley caught the last of the evening light and held it, golden and still, and the creek ran bright between its banks, and the cattle moved slow in the far pasture, and somewhere inside the house Cora was telling Dex something important at considerable volume, and everything that had been broken was not fixed. Exactly, because broken things did not fix. They became something else, something that knew what it had survived. And what it had survived had made it worth keeping.